So I really enjoyed Conference Report's most recent video on free will being Newtonian, and I thought I would say some things about the, I guess, what I take to be the real problem here. And I think partly it's that there seems to be a pitting of positions as if some people have what amounts to be something like a scientific naturalism, and it's an atheism of biological reproduction without any purpose other than reproduction, something like this. And then that's being pitted against something like a kind of pantheism of the phantasmagorical sort where people are being, I guess, either labeled into or espousing a position of, I guess, something like a divinity come home to roost in the cosmos itself, and that I don't know, I guess people would say something like, that everything is God or something like this. Consciousness itself is all within the mind of God, and that includes us, something like this. I think, that's one of the aspects of it. I think there's also related to this is the sort of overstressing of a on one hand, organic metaphors, and I think that is really much appreciated, the difference between electrochemical and mechanical. So I think that has to be stressed. And I greatly appreciate the way that Fred stressed that in his video. He tried to underscore that, we're not going to be able to comprehend simplest electrochemical phenomena by bringing mechanical metaphors to bear on those issues and those phenomena. I think the way that I would want to come into it, though, is to ask, what are the proper ways to understand part and whole? How are we to understand part and whole when we move from the mechanical to the organic? See, this is so much of what Dewey and Bentley were concerned with in their book Knowing in the Known. What they want to address is what they came to call a kind of transactionalism. And transactionalism differed from the sort of earlier worldview, which assumed a kind of objective, real status of things in the world as if things would be unaffected by their interactions with the other world. Again, their sort of early position was something like a billiard ball or a objects moving around, pushing each other through causal relations in space. And their notions of transaction had to do with organisms and life forms which were affected in their very being through the course of their interaction with their environment. When we start to look at things like, epigenetics and the development of certain diseases from environmental stimuli, even though there was a genetic predisposition, or when we try to look at the development of allergies, there are so many different ways that the body is not just mechanical. If by mechanical we mean, objects having parts which interact with larger wholes, because usually when we talk about the mechanical, the objects that are parts, when they relate to the whole, they remain structurally unaffected in their interaction. Now, they may break down or they may slowly have a loss of function through wear and tear, but it's different to say that in their being and in their internal structure, they're affected by not only their interactions, but their understanding of those interactions. Okay, so I think part of the way to come into the larger problem then is to say, what is it about the way that people think about themselves that is creating these kind of obstacles where people get pitted into positions which are very reductive? I mean, they seem to make sense only because you pigeonhole of a great sort of infinite complexity of whatever all of this is. And you compare that to words like, it's a machine, or it's a, chemical electrical process, or even if we say it's a series of perceptions and interpretations. And no matter what you say about it, you're going to delimit and reduce a kind of understanding of it. I think part of the task, though, is to say what is the largest possible whole that we could begin with? What's the largest possible whole? See, I think we're in error if we begin with the body. As much as all this experience is embodied, the body itself is not an ultimate whole. See, this is part of the problem. See, when Heidegger uses the word Dasein, he's purposefully trying to suggest that there is a common phenomena of the there here. There's a there here. That is, there's always some there that's co-disclosed along with a body's here. There's never just a body here without a there disclosed, and you can't ever get a there, whatever it is, whether it's an imagined there or a perceived there, a touched there, a seen there. You can't ever have a there without some sort of body that's a here as a correlate to it. Now, so when he says Dasein, he's trying to get at this clearing that includes the world and the body that is opened to that world. See, part of what he's doing is trying to problematize the very worldhood of the world. It's as if the world is imagined by people to be just an object, like a thing over there, and then they imagine that their bodies are just like a thing, an object over here, and then in some way, I guess, of a representing function, some sort of cognitive representation, people construct and elaborate symbolic representations that allow them to mediate between this world that's out there and this body that's over here. As much as that may make sense to some people, that's so insidious and it's so dangerous. It over-reifies. It gives a misplaced concreteness. It makes it seem as if there ever was a world independent of a kind of, I don't know, a body that would open to it in certain spatial temporal forms of abstraction. See, what we take to be the world as it is in itself is really an imagined world. It's a kind of world that's been deworlded of its particular spatial temporal embodiments, I guess, that we would have from the perspectives that we have from having our bodies. We don't ever get at this thing called the world. There's never a body independent of a world, right? Neither one of these can really be understood independent of the other. And yet we seem to still have some notion of a world as a thing there that bodies happen to occasionally look at or interact with. And I think we do think of bodies as given things, complicated machines that eventually, again, wear down and break down. We don't seem to see the radical transaction that's going on developmentally and ontogenetically in both the worlding of the world and in the development of the person. A person is not simply a mechanical object. We're not just in space and time. We're clearings of care, and the world itself it has orientations of care that to try to reduce it to something mechanical, as if it had parts and the parts had an independent status and those parts sort of do what they do and maintain an integrity of identity, despite all their kinds of commerce with what's around them. That's really to misunderstand the phenomena. You're not under. I think people are not understanding what a person is. They don't understand how babies come into the world. We could come at it very simply that way. They don't understand what respiration is, what metabolism is, what digestion is, what it means to be able to have a conversation with someone and then come to a new understanding of self and decide to become a vegetarian. Decide to totally change one's dietary practices, to totally change how one proceeds in one's life, to be the kind of organism that gets released from a web of tribal connections or tribal resonance and then gets freed into the autonomy and legislation of making promises to oneself. This is something that happened in history. It's a radical transpiring that has occurred. To underestimate what has happened in freeing up the individual to something like the right to make promises to oneself, the burden of guilt and conscience as those have become historical possibilities of the world and of people through communication technologies. This is what is not being understood. Communication technologies are, many of them, communication technologies are the best place to come at this problem of how self and world are related or tied together or brought, are they brought into connection? Are they separated out? We start to see that it's not just the mechanical nor the electrochemical, because communication technologies span all of those. Right, the first communication technologies were invisible machines of orchestrated bodies through the spoken word. And then slowly we look at, writing. Writing begins organically on vellum with blood and parchment and ink that comes organically. Only slowly does the mechanical principle of the printing press replace the wiggly, swirly organicism of the oral and then even the early forms of written word. But by the time we're here today in the electric age, it's a world of photons and digital information compressed and spent around the globe at a speed very unlike any machine to try to deal with what is going on here in a video that has audio, and to try to address visual audio phenomena as they can be shared in cultural ways as a mechanical phenomenon is to completely miss it. We need to see that there is a kind of ongoing transaction. It includes everything. And it's not about some sort of pantheism as it's being suggested. I think that to me those are people who are sandbagging other people with some sort of position that they have a criticism for, and they want to force the phantasmagorical issue of it. I think all you need to suggest is somehow in nature it evolved the capacity through, I guess, first organisms that had some kind of capacity to develop mechanisms and forms of communication technologies that would act back upon them in organic ways. That we were able to create environments which acted back upon us and so radically transformed who we were. It's not just that we're the same old us, but we've added new environments. Is that these new environments have changed who we are through and through. We now are individuals who experience a sense of freedom and autonomy. Now, it's not some superlative freedom and autonomy in the fantastical way, but to try to ignore the way that the history of communication technologies has made possible a freestanding individual who, through law and through governance and through collective, I guess, negotiating of contracts and promises, is able to experience something like a free will. People can choose to get married to certain people. Now, in cultures where marriages are completely arranged, I don't know what kind of experience of freedom that we have there. But in cultures where people at least choose to, who they're going to marry and who they're going to procreate with, I think you have to admit that there's something like freedom there. Now, is this some sort of ultimate fantastical freedom? No. But is it blind, no freedom at all, that everything can be understood by understanding these very basic principles that were there at the beginning? No, that's not going to work either. The task is to understand the emergence of new forms of worlding and self that have been made possible by forms of mediation, communication mediation, and all of this is a kind of transaction. When I say transaction, again, I'm talking about Dewey Bentley's work on how it's not simply a mechanistic movement of parts and wholes where the parts and wholes remain unaffected in their interactions. It has to do with dynamic living systems where the actual parts, the organic parts, are transformed in their very being as a result of their interactions with the larger environment. The environment changes and the organisms change. I think there seems to be sort of static metaphors operating in the backdrop of some of the conversations I've heard that I think leads people into this, again, a kind of false dichotomy where people are seen as either having to adopt something like a scientific naturalism that's bereft of any notion of purpose, or it's wholly mechanical, or some kind of pantheistic, consciousness itself is divinity here moving in the planet. I think what you can say is no, that the self-aware cosmos came to pass when that organism evolved, right, through evolutionary process. An organism was freed into the capacity to create environments which would then act back upon it, and through thousands of years of tampering, we have now woken up. We've found ourselves thrown into a self-awareness, an autonomy and an experience of individual agency and free will and choice and decision, which is very real, and it is the cosmos itself. It's not that I'm not the cosmos, but it doesn't mean that it's some fantastical agency outside of those purposes that were adopted within, I guess, a range of natural evolutionary processes. But right now, we don't want to simply say that consciousness is something uniquely human. It's not. It's something that came from this larger process, this absolute whole of all wholes. But that doesn't mean that the whole of all wholes somehow pre-designed it or had agency there in the beginning. But that doesn't mean that it's all mechanical. It's way too simplistic. Thayer once has a great line that appears in some of his writings, but he says that we judge theories not on their ability to accurately represent the facts, but are they simple enough for us to understand? I think that's what goes on in so many of these kinds of conversation. Okay, thanks.